Hey y'all! It's entry number 81 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Darnell Mooney, wide receiver, Chicago Bears. We'll start with the positives with Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile. Number 1 receiving option. After seeing 140 targets last year and his primary competition for targets, Allen Robinson, go to Los Angeles, it's crystal clear that Darnell Mooney will be the Bears' number 1 receiving option in 2022. The next thing I really like about Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile is his targets per route. Darnell Mooney was already one of the top wide receivers in terms of targets per route, with 29.6%, finishing top 5 last year according to fantasy data. The only receivers that he finished behind in this stat were Cooper Kupp at 34.1%, A.J. Brown at 32.2%, Davante Adams at 31.9%, and Stephon Diggs at 31.1%. Which is fantastic company and suggests that Mooney may have a higher ceiling than most expect. The last major thing I really like about Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile is his air yards. Darnell Mooney had 1,479 air yards, the 13th most among wide receivers, a 35.3% air yard share, the 14th highest among wide receivers, and 815 unrealized air yards, the 9th most among wide receivers in 2021 according to Player Profiler. These numbers show that Mooney has a solid ceiling if he can get on the same page with Justin Fields more in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile. Subpar quarterback play. As a passer, Justin Fields really struggled during the 2021 season, completing just 159 passes on 270 passing attempts for 1,870 passing yards and throwing more interceptions than touchdowns over the course of his 12 games. If Fields doesn't improve as a passer, it will be hard for Mooney to build upon his 2021 performance. The next concern I have with Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile is the fact that he plays in a bad offense. The Chicago Bears don't have the most talented offense in the NFL, as the team ranked 24th in yards per game with 307.4 and 27th in points per game, 18.3 points per game last year according to Pro Football Reference. Playing in a below average offense may make it more difficult for Mooney to put up solid fantasy numbers. The last major concern I have with Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile is that he's not a major red zone threat. Darnell Mooney is a smaller wide receiver who is listed at just 5'10" and 176 pounds, and that may make it more difficult for him to get a ton of red zone usage. In each of his first 2 seasons in his career, Mooney saw just 10 red zone targets in both 2020 and 2021 over the course of an entire season according to NFL Savant. Even with putting on some weight this offseason to play a little stronger, it's unlikely that he suddenly becomes a major red zone threat. Some additional thoughts on Darnell Mooney's fantasy profile. In 2021, Darnell Mooney finished as the WR22 in Standard, with 138.7 total fantasy points and 8.2 fantasy points per game. The WR24 in half PPR formats, with 179.2 total fantasy points and 10.5 fantasy points per game. And the WR23 in full PPR formats, with 219.7 total fantasy points and 12.9 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Darnell Mooney had 3 out of 17 games with 0 to 4.9 fantasy points, 7 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 10 to 14.9 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Darnell Mooney tied for the 5th most drops in the NFL in 2021, with 9 according to Pro Football Reference. Coaching. The Chicago Bears will have a new offensive play caller in 2022 as they go from Matt Nagy or Bill Lazor calling the plays to new offensive coordinator Luke Getsy calling the plays. This will be Getsy's first time calling plays at the NFL level, but he does have some prior experience calling plays at the college level. Darnell Mooney is an incredibly fast NFL player who ran a 4.38 40-yard dash at the 2020 NFL Combine. personal opinion. Darnell Mooney is currently going off the board as WR25 about pick 74 overall on ESPN and WR33 about pick 95 overall on Yahoo. I'm more lukewarm on his ADP on ESPN, but I think he's a great buy on Yahoo at his current price. Being top 5 in targets per route run makes me think he has the upside to be a low-end WR1, high-end WR2. Think like a Deontay Johnson type of season last year, if everything goes perfectly. But as we know, the Bears' offense is likely to be subpar again, which makes it more likely that he finishes as a WR2 high-end flex play. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Darnell Mooney's My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.